Lucky Day, a short story by Roy L. Pickering Jr., as read by the author. Some days you can just do no wrong, thought Dan, as he headed towards his girlfriend's apartment. And for him, today happened to be one of them. His lucky streak started off first thing in the morning. The radio station he listened to, as he dressed for work, was giving away concert tickets to see his idol, Bruce Springsteen. All he needed to do was be caller number 95. He had a better shot at parting the Red Sea. The DJ picked up on the first ring. Dan would be sitting front row center. He'd never even tried to win anything from the radio before, but since it was the boss, he figured it certainly wouldn't hurt to try. That figuring had turned out to be extremely understated. The day whisked by as Dan basked in the glow of his good fortune. Plus it was an abbreviated one, because he needed to leave work early to make an appointment with his doctor. Before going to the subway station, he went into the supermarket around the corner from his job. Dan had a ritual to perform. Every day after work, Dan would come here and head straight towards the gumball machine. It was filled with miniature replicas of NFL football helmets. Dan had been putting quarters into it for the last 6 months, but to no avail. He never got the helmet of his favorite team, the Green Bay Packers. Dan stood before his mechanical nemesis and fished through his pocket. He knew he shouldn't be doing this. Dan would have to borrow $5 to be considered broke. Yet he spent every day squandering precious coins. He promised himself that this would be the last time. 1 quarter was all that Dan found in his pocket. It no doubt could have been put to better use, such as helping to reduce his growing pile of laundry at home. But nevertheless, he kissed it to God, just as he used to do with dropped candy when he was a boy. Then he placed George Washington's profile into the allotted slot. One twist of his wrist, and out came the plastic bubble. Unbelievable! The helmet of the Green Bay Packers. There was no denying it now. This was definitely his lucky day. A short while later, Dan got off the train and headed towards his doctor's office. He repeatedly tossed his prize into the air, alternating between his two hands. Toss it with the right, catch it with the left. Toss it with the left, catch it with the right. A block away from his destination, he misjudged the toss, and the plastic bubble rolled under a parked car. As he bent down to pick it up, his eye noticed a green piece of paper. A $50 bill. Lady Luck definitely had the hots for him today. Dan was a man unaccustomed to such favorable fortune. Not that he considered life to have given him less than he deserved, but it certainly had not given him more. Not like his old friend Rick, who must have been born under the right star or something. Over the years, everything from good grades to beautiful women, to financial riches, to inexplicable talent at a variety of vocations was afforded to Rick. He excelled at everything he attempted, no matter how little effort he exerted or concern he held for the task. Rick was always in the right place. It was always the right time for him. He was adored by all those whose paths he crossed, as if they sensed that they were in the presence of someone who had been touched by divinity. As much as Dan admired the feats and triumphs of his friend, he would have loved to beat Rick in something just once, to do a single thing better, longer, faster, or first. 2 hours later, Dan was confronted with his least favorite aspect of living in New York City: rush hour on the subway. Dan could think of preferable places to be. War-torn Iraq, for example. Attica would suffice. As long as he wasn't in a hurry and his destination was less than 30 blocks away, he usually walked. But there were 90 blocks between the starting line of his doctor's office and finish line of his girlfriend's apartment. He did have $50 in his pocket, so he could have taken a cab. But those guys often did not have change for a big bill, and Dan didn't want to squander any of his newfound cash just yet. He decided to be frugal and endure the subway at the unholy hour of 5 o'clock in the afternoon. A train pulled in just as Dan arrived on the platform. The doors opened and the masses squeezed into the already filled car like a nostalgic beer-bellied 40-year-old man trying to fit into his high school baseball uniform. Dan was exhausted. The doctor had put him through quite a workout. He would have given anything to be seated, instead of hanging from a strap hanger like a side of beef in an overpacked meat locker. Then a miracle happened. For whatever reason, the person seated directly in front of him chose to get up. There were no senior citizens or pregnant women in sight to guilt Dan out of it, so he swiftly dropped into the seat, pleased as a baby drawing milk from his mother. When he arrived at his girlfriend's door, Dan reached into his pocket and retrieved the spare key she had recently given him. This was as sure a sign as could be given that a relationship was getting serious. Dan couldn't have been happier about it. He was crazy about Sharon. She wasn't expecting him. Dan usually called before he came over, especially since her home doubled as her place of business, but today he hadn't. He had something important to tell her, and wanted to do all talking face to face. Besides, he didn't have any change on him to place the call. One day he would have to invest in a cell phone, but only out of absolute necessity, not because it was the trendy thing to do, as he suspected was the reason why more than half of them were purchased. He certainly saw no purpose to buying one that also served as a camera, stereo, television, fax machine, and massager. There was such a thing as being too inventive, in Dan's opinion. Alexander Graham Bell pretty much nailed it when he created the first telephone. Push buttons were a nice improvement over dialing. Beyond that, the bombardment of additional features over the years was pure overkill. Not everything needed to be elaborate. Mankind had lost its ability to appreciate the fine art of simplicity. Dan entered his girlfriend's apartment and gave his plastic bubble a pleased gaze. Sharon knew all about the crusade he had been undertaking to get it. She would be happy for him. Maybe he would celebrate by taking her out to dinner. He could certainly afford it now. She was not in the living room or the kitchen, and the open bathroom door revealed that it was also empty. Either she had run out to take care of an errand, or else perhaps she was taking a nap. Lately it seemed she was always tired. Well, not always, just when he was in the mood to make love. The dual sounds reached his ears just as his hand touched the doorknob to her bedroom. Seconds later, his eyes confirmed what he thought he had heard and desperately hoped he had not. Sharon was moaning as she did only during the heights of passion, in this case, courtesy of Rick. Dan's first impulse was to rush in and beat his friend to a pulp. How could he do this to him? How could she do this to him? How could they do this to each other? And what was the name of that position they were in? The mighty charge that Dan made consisted of one step. It took that long for him to remember that Rick spent hours in the gym building up an impressive grouping of muscles, so therefore could twist him like a pretzel if the occasion called for it. Dan closed the door, leaving his former best friend and best girl to do their business. His heart felt leaden. His tear ducts threatened to erupt. What a shame that something as pretty as love could turn out to be so shabby and cruel. Unable to think of anything else to do, Dan walked away. With each step, his sense of betrayal grew stronger. He had confided in Rick many times about how much he cared for Sharon. Rick already had a gorgeous girlfriend of his own, who was no less than a runway model. And if he wanted to be with someone else, plenty of other women were more than willing to volunteer their services. He should have considered Sharon off limits. Granted, he was unfamiliar with the concept of limitations on his actions and achievements. Still, there was no excuse for what Rick had done. Maybe he could come to forgive Sharon, though. It seemed ridiculous to be considering such a thing, but Dan couldn't help it. He was so madly in love with her that not even the sight of her in carnal embrace with another man was enough to convince him that it was over. It couldn't be over. After all, he had cheated on her too. His indiscretion had taken place 1 month earlier, and he had been beating himself up over it ever since. The woman had been so drunk, the opportunity given to Dan with such little effort on his part, that he was regretfully unable to resist. He had not been brave enough to confess his sin to Sharon, but he'd done everything he could since then to make it up to her. Maybe he was now receiving his just desserts. Maybe he and Sharon could start over again with a clean slate. Yes, perhaps he would forgive her. But not Rick. Not Mr. Physical Fitness, Mr. Casanova, Mr. Perfect. No matter how much he possessed, he always wanted more. And he always got it. Dan took a moment to rein his resentment in. It had not been easy to play the part of Rick's best friend for these many years without being consumed by envy. Dan had been forced to master the art of not begrudging or coveting the many bounties that came Rick's way. He learned to seek out the bright side of his own far less impressive set of circumstances. And after he hooked up with Sharon, there was no more reason to be jealous of anyone. So Dan managed to convince himself, just as he had done on many prior occasions, that he was dwelling too much on the negative. He reminded himself to recognize that things could certainly be worse for him. He did, after all, have a pair of tickets to Bruce Springsteen coming his way, and 50 extra bucks were in his pocket, along with his treasured package helmet. To top things off, there was the important news he had to share with Sharon, the secret he had been about to reveal before finding her in such a compromising position. Sooner or later, she and Rick would both find out. Dan's doctor had confirmed his suspicions. He had contracted herpes. He should have known there would be a price to pay for a single night of no strings attached and no protection worn passion. No doubt he had already given his burden to Sharon, which meant that it was being transferred to Rick at this very moment. Rick's run of perfection would be coming to an end. From now on, at least in one department, Rick would be no better off than Dan. Some would call it poetic justice, others an eye for an eye, and there were those who would place it under the category of God's mysterious sense of humor. Dan applied none of these labels, for he knew full well what the reason was for this latest turn of events. This was his lucky day.